Hey folks, I'm Andrew Latour from Gemba Red. Thaddeus asked me to do this course on red light therapy, so I put together a bunch of slides and I'll be behind the slides, but I just wanted to say hi as a quick intro. Hope you enjoy. Okay, let's get started. We're going to jump right into red light therapy hacks. So we're going to cover some of the science and a lot of the practical aspects of using red light therapy. And an important note is that we also include near infrared, so generally people just say red light therapy, but usually we're also including near infrared when we talk about red light therapy. Sometimes that's a point of confusion that people just say red light therapy for brevity, but really we're including near infrared most of the time in these discussions. So you can see the near infrared bulbs are these invisible bulbs that don't emit any visible light that the human eye can see, but it's very beneficial. It's very similar to red light, except it's just a little bit longer. And I'm Andrew Latour. I'm a chemical engineer by training. We founded Gemba Red LLC in 2017, and we started selling our first products in early 2018. So we've got a lot of history and experience with this stuff. And, we've been making red light therapy panels, and then we got into making red night lights, plug-in night lights, light bulbs, and desk lamps, and book lights. All those for more of the ambient lights at night to help with your circadian rhythm, so you can avoid the blue-rich lights at night, and that's really good for ambient lighting. But in contrast, red light therapy is more directly towards the cells, towards the skin, towards the body, and is more directly affecting how the cells work, as opposed to, the night lights and ambient lights. That's more of how it affects your eyes and circadian cycles, but red light therapy is more of a cellular target. And naturally, we do sell these products. So we're going to be talking about more practical applications that you can find on the market. We're not going to talk about, lasers or other topics. We're going to try to stay on the topic that we're experts in, is red light therapy panels and products that we make. And we've got some medical disclaimers that this isn't medical advice, but it's very educational. We're going to learn a lot of practical aspects and how you might want to use it for your own health. But as always, you've got to consult with your doctor or health coaches or whoever it might be to really think it through if it's right for your condition. So we're going to start at a very high level view. It's looking at the entire electromagnetic spectrum. And this is, one of the four fundamental forces of physics and how reality is kind of glued together. In addition, we've got gravity, weak forces, and strong forces. So it's very fundamental. And obviously our bodies have, been designed to accommodate all these different frequencies, and how they interact has been a big concern in recent years. So we can start with the extremely low frequency EMFs down here. That's because of our power grids is running on a 60 hertz AC cycle. In some countries it's 50 hertz, but that's where the ELF is coming from a lot of appliances, and even from devices, red light therapy devices, saunas, and things like that you have to watch out for. So that's a big component of our daily lives. Then we get into radio frequencies, which is a huge component of the spectrum, and obviously it's for communications. It can send these wavelengths over long distances, or used for Wi-Fi, for cell phones, and even microwaves, because that gets absorbed by water and heats stuff up. So that's also a big part of our current reality. Then we have daylight, which again we can appreciate is on the same spectrum as all this, but it's a very narrow spectrum of natural wavelengths that we get from the sunlight that we were evolved to, our bodies are acclimated to from evolution. And red light therapy is just a small component of this spectrum. Then as we get into very short frequencies, it's very high energy kind of frequencies, and that's where you get ionizing radiation like X-rays and gamma rays and things like that, that can disrupt how molecules are working, and if it gets into the cells, it disrupts how they're working, and that's why they can become problematic. And there's kind of a misnomer that tanning is not an ionizing radiation because it's UV. Sometimes people falsely label it as ionizing radiation, like this chart is incorrectly doing. But we know UV is very beneficial for, producing vitamin D and producing melanin in the skin. So this should be closer to the daylight. Then if we zoom in just a little bit, just focusing on the sunlight spectrum, sometimes it's called the optical radiation spectrum. It's covering from 100 nanometers all the way up to about 1,000,000 nanometers. So it's a very big range of wavelengths. But as you can see, we can only see a small range of visible light from 400 nanometers up to about 780 nanometers. And it starts with the shorter wavelengths, the violets and the blues, and then into the greens, the yellows, the reds, and then we get into the near infrared. Sometimes it's called IRA, and then mid infrared is IRB, and then far infrared is IRC. And so sometimes we call infrared light is light, but it's not actually anything visible. We don't want to say infrared radiation because that sounds scary. So we call it infrared light, but we don't actually see any brightness from it. And we already discussed that, most of this spectrum is very natural, is what sunlight has given us, is what all, cells and early organisms have evolved to adapt to utilize for beneficial reasons. And also, we have natural protections in our skin from excessive sunlight. In contrast, we've got non-native EMFs, and that's the artificial EMFs like from radios and cell phones and the ELFs from our AC grid. So wavelength is going to be a word we're going to use a lot, and that's usually measured in nanometers for this range of wavelengths. Sometimes if you get into, the radio frequencies, those could be meters. So it's the distance between each wave. So if you look at some of these diagrams, it's from one peak to the next peak is literally, a certain amount of nanometers. So that's why it's measured that way. It's literally how many nanometers it takes from one peak to the next peak. So we're going to be discussing, wavelengths in terms of nanometers most of the time. And, there's always a corresponding frequency. So we're going to see this term a lot because frequency is the hertz, which is how often something cycles per second. So whenever you see the term Hz, that means hertz, and that means how often something happens per second. And you have to really, pay attention to the context because, you can measure meters in a different context, just like how you can measure frequencies in different contexts. But for frequency, for hertz, that's how often it cycles. Then we have photons, which, it's when an EMF acts as like a particle. We hear the famous saying that, light and EMFs, they act as a wave and as a particle. So when they're acting as a particle, we're kind of referring to them as photons. And a lot of times it's more of just like a little packet of energy. So each photon has its own amount of energy, and that can have, different effects on when it encounters a molecule and how it interacts with those molecules. So you get to this relationship where if you have higher frequencies, if you're on the UV end of the spectrum, you'll also tend to have higher photon energy per photon, and then they end up being lower wavelengths. So they're kind of all intrinsically connected that way. And then vice versa, if you have a low frequency, then you're getting into the far infrareds, and then you also have lower photon energy in the far infrareds and things like that, and then you tend to have longer wavelengths. So they kind of have that relationship of how they interact. So here we have the actual solar spectrum that we can download from the ASTM website, and it gives you this different proportions of all the different wavelengths, so we can follow along the wavelengths down here at the bottom, and just the relative irradiance on the left-hand side. So the sun is the ultimate, light therapy device, so we can always appreciate that it gives us all the different colors and all the different wavelengths that we need in their proper proportions. So it's not always equal of what the proportions are. So only 5% is UV, but it's very important wavelength range. And then we get 15% is blue, 11% is green, yellow is a small range of only 5%, and then we get red, which is 24% of the spectrum, and near infrared is 34% of the spectrum, and there is a little bit of mid infrared and far infrared as well, but I cut that off. But you can see such a huge proportion of the spectrum is red and near infrared, and if we're living an indoor lifestyle, and we've gotten rid of incandescent bulbs, we've gotten rid of fireplaces and stoves and things like that, really we're devoid of the red and near infrared, where, a lot of studies were focused on the lack of UV and the vitamin D, but now we're really appreciating this big proportion of the spectrum that we're missing out on that we might need to supplement, in terms of getting artificial devices like red light therapy devices. And a rough idea of sunlight, the intensity is 100 milliwatts per centimeter squared. That's across the whole range, and so the math is really easy. If you want to multiply 100 times any of these percentages, you can get the rough amount of milliwatts per centimeter squared for each of these ranges. So we can appreciate that, sunlight is kind of the ultimate, full spectrum, literally, of light therapy. Okay, let's go through all these different wavelengths. There are photobiomodulation effects for any wavelength. So these are non-thermal effects for, what we can study with different wavelengths. As long as it's kind of a non-thermal interaction, that's still under the umbrella of photobiomodulation. So a lot of times it's a misnomer that people think photobiomodulation is only red and near-infrared light. That just happens to be the most popular for its safety and effectiveness and penetration. But really you can do photobiomodulation with any wavelength. So we know ultraviolet is very important for the production of vitamin D. It also improves the melanin production and causes tanning, so that's very good. Melanin's very important as an antioxidant itself. And then it also has antibacterial effects, antimicrobial, antiviral, all good for kind of killing stuff on the surfaces. It doesn't penetrate very deep, but it's good for some of that surface level effect. And, there's still a lot of studies that haven't told us what's the systemic effects, that even though it's superficial, it could still help us deeper into the body, like the way of producing vitamin D. That's a systemic effect that helps your whole body. Blue light is very similar. It also has antibacterial, antimicrobial, antiviral effects. It's good at kind of killing stuff. And then it's good for, fighting acne, psoriasis, eczema. That's a couple of things it's been studied for. Again, notice that these are a little bit more superficial skin type problems that it's been used for so far. And, it also increases melanin. So if you have trouble with hyperpigmentation and melasma, you might want to avoid blue light or use it very carefully. And it can be pro-inflammatory. Some of these UV and blue light and green light, because they're superficially absorbed and they're higher energy, that too much dose ends up being pro-inflammatory. And again, that's where some of the issues with artificial light in general, especially for the eyes being more sensitive. But in general, it can be more pro-inflammatory, and it's always good to combine it with red and near-infrared. That helps kind of balance it out. There's a lot of studies that combine blue light and red and near-infrared for beneficial effects. Then we get the green light benefits. That's been studied a little bit for wound healing, for cellulite, and maybe it's been used for headaches and migraines. There's been a couple studies where they lock people into a dark room and have a green light, and it somehow cures their migraines. But so far, there's not a lot of studies on green light, even though, there's a lot of myths of what green light can do, and potentially we'll find that in the future. Similar with yellow light, there's not a lot of studies on yellow light on its own. It can help reduce pigmentation. There's some good studies about that. But it's usually used more as a combination with red and near-infrared and different wavelengths as a combination kind of thing. So we don't know what yellow does exactly on its own yet. And then red and near-infrared, we'll be diving into that much deeper with the rest of these slides. With what the benefits are, but it tends to penetrate deeper than all the other wavelengths. We can see this kind of chart where we get superficial with blue, with UV, with green, and then red and near infrared get that deeper penetration, and then the far infrared and mid infrareds actually get less penetration because they get water absorption. So when you get into the mid and far infrared, that's where you start to get more of the heat therapies. You can get infrared saunas, infrared pads that you wrap yourself and use as kind of a heat pad. They're good for wound healing, good for improving circulation, and indirectly help with heart and brain health because they're releasing nitric oxide and improving that circulation. And the benefits of sauna and detoxification is all really good for your whole body. So there are a lot of applications, obviously, for mid-infrared and far infrared. So just a quick modern history of red light therapy. It's not something particularly new. It's, not a fad. It's been around for a while. It can be traced back to even Niels Ryberg-Finsen. In 1903, he received a Nobel Prize for using light therapy for tuberculosis. And he also documented using red lights, like red curtains and red glass windows for smallpox patients. There was a dark ages in around the 1930s and 1940s when penicillin came around and the FDA came around and a lot of the medical establishment came around, and they kind of tried to demonize a lot of the alternative light therapies. And so that's why, there's a big gap in history where there wasn't a lot of light therapy. Then shortly after the laser was invented, Andre Mester in the 1960s, he discovered this laser biostimulation when he was accidentally using low power lasers on mice. He was doing some sort of cancer research, and he accidentally used low power lasers, and he found that the mice he was treating with these lasers, they had faster wound healing and faster hair growth, and so he ended up being one of the first research to start to look into this laser biostimulation. So what we call red light therapy has scientific names that include low-level laser therapy and low-level light therapy, both with the same acronym LLLT, and more recently the definition of the word photobiomodulation, it's PBM. So those are the keywords that you would use if you go into PubMed or if you want to find scholarly research. You can find tons of studies on PubMed by putting in those keywords, low-level laser therapy or photobiomodulation, and then also, whatever condition you're trying to research. So you can find tons and tons of studies on PubMed and different databases for clinical trials. So red light therapy has been rapidly growing and getting that research behind it, and that's why it's so popular today. The FDA does not regulate LED devices for general wellness because they're so safe and they're so low risk. They don't have a lot of specific regulations on them, which is kind of a good thing, but it also makes it kind of a wild west. In the late 1990s, NASA used some LEDs for wound healing. They initially were using them for plant growth, but found it could also be used for wound healing and things like that. And so you can find some of their studies by Dr. Harry Whelan in PubMed in different areas. And then, it kind of took, the mainstream FDA to approve some of these laser therapies. They were more popular in kind of Eastern countries, and it's taken a lot longer for Western countries to adopt these cold lasers. That's kind of a popular term you might hear at chiropractics and things like that it doesn't actually cool you. It's actually just a laser that doesn't cause any heating. And that's kind of the therapy, is these low power lasers and LEDs that don't cause heating. And, we can find a little bit of history that some of them were first FDA approved in 2002 and even in, 2009, 2012. So it took a while for us to really get a grip on getting some FDA approvals and getting some mainstream attention. But the great thing is that in 2023, the FDA recently made a medical device definition for photobiomodulation specifically. So now if you do want your LED device or photobiomodulation device approved for a specific condition, that way you can make marketing claims for it. Then you can go through the FDA channels, and hopefully that paves the path that this can get covered by insurance, and this can get covered, by more mainstream doctors and things like that. So this is, going to be a big step. Is once it gets approved and covered by insurance, that'll really steamroll a lot of mainstream adoption too. So there are two special things about red and near-infrared light. One is how deep they penetrate. They penetrate deeper than the rest of the wavelengths on the spectrum. And of course, the mechanisms and the benefits that they have. So the science has defined kind of this optical window of the skin between 600 nanometers to 1100 nanometers, where in this range we get the best penetration of these wavelengths. And this is formed by our understanding of how melanin, hemoglobin, and water absorbs superficial wavelengths. The shorter wavelengths get picked up by melanin and hemoglobin, and longer wavelengths get picked up by water. So it's only within this optical window that we tend to get the best penetration. And it's important to consider this diagram of penetration, that it doesn't go down in a straight line. It gets scattered off to the sides, and it's getting absorbed all along the way. So it gets exponentially kind of decreases as it goes deeper and deeper, so you only get a limited amount that actually reaches those deeper layers. So if we say, okay, depending on the context, it can go anywhere from, 20 to 40 millimeters. Only a small fraction is actually reaching those deeper depths. So typical wavelengths that you'll see in studies and in consumer products is 630, 660, 670. Those are the reds. And then in the near infrared, usually you use low 800s, so 810, 830, and 850 are very popular. And then there's another range in around 1064 that's also got good penetration and benefits. Usually we skip over the 700s and the 900s just because, there's not as good studies. The studies that do use them aren't as successful. And, the 900s has a little bit more limited penetration because it gets more water absorption. So you usually don't see these wavelengths. And a good example is about 1 to 3% of near-infrared is assumed to reach the brain when applied transcranially, and that just means through the scalp and through the skull. Only a small percentage actually reaches the brain. But overall, that's a good thing because we don't want too much light reaching the brain. That's why we have hair and scalp and skull. But that small percentage is enough to stimulate the mitochondria in the brain. So we don't have to worry about overpowering, our skin and our, overheating our skin just for deeper penetration, but it's good to keep this kind of stuff in mind. Okay, the mechanisms of red light therapy. So, there's tons of benefits, and it really goes back to the mitochondria of the cell. That's our powerhouse of the cell. It's producing the ATP. And the way it makes ATP is on the electron transport chain. And on this electron transport chain, we have complex 4, which is called cytochrome C oxidase. So red and near-infrared light is thought primarily to be absorbed by this complex 4, and it gets stimulated and it improves its output of completing its step for producing ATP. And one of the mechanisms is thought that it kicks off nitric oxide, which could be bound to the complex 4, and that kicks off that nitric oxide that was acting as a inhibitory molecule, and it allows oxygen to come into its place and complete its cycle. And there's a ton of other studies and theories for how it works. There's a lot of indirect ways it's upregulating the ATP production as well. Another study says it upregulates complex 5, which is the ATC synthase, and it's reducing the ROS and forming exclusion zone water in that area. So, there's a lot of interesting studies, and one of the more recent theories is that it's forming easy water. You might have heard of it from Gerald Pollack's research, and it's a very important type of water that gets built in the cells when it's exposed to infrared light. So it gets built up in the body. You can also drink it too, but if you just shine infrared light at yourself, then you're building easy water in your cells, and that's very beneficial too as a form of energy. Okay, let's talk about the benefits of red and near-infrared light, and there's a ton of them because any cell in the body that has mitochondria can stand to benefit from red light therapy. And since most of our cells have mitochondria, they can use it. And, organs and important systems tend to have more mitochondria, and they are more reliant on needing that extra energy. So that's why we get all these lists of benefits, and I try to make this chart to really highlight the overlap that both red and near-infrared both can do. They improve ATP production, improve your energy production, and that gives you better recovery, better reduced inflammation, better wound healing, supports eye health, mental health, brain health, skin care, sleep, pain, all these different areas, workout recovery, just tons and tons of benefits. And, it's important to remember that there's a lot of overlap from red and near-infrared. So, a lot of times people can kind of overthink things, or they hear some marketing rhetoric that near-infrared is only good for deep penetration and red is more for the superficial stuff like skincare. That's kind of more of an oversimplification for marketing reasons. And really the best thing to do is to combine both red and near-infrared simultaneously. So it doesn't matter if you're doing deep penetration stuff, combine red and near-infrared. If you're doing skincare stuff, combine red and near-infrared. So always combine them. Again, if you want to experiment with individual wavelengths, that's fine, but usually they seem to work better when they're combined. And we see, red acts a little bit more on the cytochrome C oxidase mechanisms, where near-infrared is a little bit more on the easy water mechanisms. Red can be used as kind of a stand-in for bright light therapy because these red light panels tend to be very bright, so it's very nice to use them in the mornings on the face. The near-infrared is completely invisible, so maybe you want to use near-infrared at night if you don't want to mess up your circadian rhythms. Red you can use as an ambient light, like Thaddeus uses and some other people use our therapy panels, and they just aim it at the wall or aim it at the ceiling as an ambient light. So that's nice to use at night too, as long as you're not directly using it on the face, at close range. you can use these lights as ambient lighting if you aim it at a wall or something. But to get the benefits of red and near-infrared light, you have to dose it properly. And so with pills and drugs and supplements, it's pretty simple. You pop a couple pills and, you think about maybe how often. You do it once a day, you do it with meals or at certain times of days, and that's it. It's very easy. With red and near-infrared light therapy, you need a certain amount of power. Obviously, you need the right wavelengths. You need a certain amount of power, usually between 5 to 50 milliwatts per centimeter squared. And then you need a certain amount of exposure time. So you want enough energy to, get affected onto the cells, so that way it gets the right kind of stimulation for the beneficial effects. Then, like I said, with drugs and other stuff, you do it at a certain interval. Sometimes you can do it once a day. You can do it twice a day if you have some really tough nagging issue, some recurring chronic pain that, you really need to manage with multiple sessions per day. But, most of the time you can get away with, if for just a maintenance kind of dose, you could do red light therapy as little as 2 to 3 times a week and still maintain some benefits over time. So it really depends on, what you're treating and the severity of what you're treating. But you have a lot of leeway for, trying out different dosing protocols. And ultimately, you need to understand these things so you can tailor it for your own lifestyle. And that's how you really optimize it. So I can't give you a perfect prescription, because I don't know you, but also just because, everyone's going to be a little bit different with how they respond. So, the key is to give you these tools. And so you understand some of these parameters and you can experiment with, more or less intensity, more or less treatment times, how frequent do you want to do it, more or less frequent, and remember that more isn't always better. So we can get into nitty gritty. You can calculate your joules, which is how much energy you get when you multiply the radians times the time. We don't need to get too gritty on that right now. And then there's skin contact and non-contact. So there's 2 different ways to dose red light therapy. If you press the device right on the skin, you eliminate some of the reflection losses and you help compress the skin to improve the penetration. Or you do non-contact, which is more of a superficial thing. It's good for superficial wounds and skincare, but you're not getting as much penetration when you do it at a distance. There's other parameters I won't get into too much, but it's important to mention pulsing. There's a lot of studies that use pulsing. Most studies use continuous wave, which means the light is just steadily on, the whole time during treatment. Pulsing is a rapid kind of on and off, like flipping on and off a switch. It's a rapid on and off at a certain amount of frequency. So you'll see different hertzes, like 10 hertz, 40 hertz, 100 hertz. And so that's how much it's flashing per second. And, that it's the most important part of pulsing is a technique for cooling the skin, for allowing in between the pulses when it's off, even for a fraction of a second, it allows your skin to cool off a little bit and then it turns back on. So, that's the pulsing. I don't think it's necessary for, a lot of consumer grain stuff. Some people are using it for like a brainwave entrainment. So if you're doing it through the skull and you want to impact like an alpha hertz frequency, that's like 10 hertz, or a gamma frequency is 40 hertz. Those are kind of brainwave frequencies that can be beneficial. But like I said, it's probably not worth experimenting on yourself unless it's really necessary. But pulsing could be a useful technique for certain types of conditions. So the Arnold-Schultz law and the biphasic dose response, this just describes that for anything that affects the body, for pharmaceuticals and things like that, that you want a certain amount of dose and that too much dose ends up being problematic. It ends up being inhibitory and isn't worth it. So especially with red light therapy, we do need to consider it as a type of pharmaceutical or a therapy that, more isn't better. So, you want to stay within a reasonable range of intensity and dose in order to get the right response. So here's a couple reference ranges for different dosages. But it's just important that practice moderation, and sometimes as you're experimenting, you might want to experiment with less dose to see if you get better results, which is often very counterintuitive. As I mentioned, sometimes you want to use skin contact to get deeper penetration, and you use non-contact for more superficial treatments. And it's just important. I just want to show these pictures that you're going to be a couple inches away from the skin for non-contact, or depending on the device, you could be 6 inches, 12 inches. So So, just listen to your manufacturer, or you use the contact method, which a lot of our smaller devices, we encourage the contact method to get more efficient results with, and we make sure our smaller devices are very low EMF, so that way you can use it on the skin without worrying about the EMF exposure. So just another diagram to show you kind of the distances. If you're doing kind of a full body panel, there is some EMFs from the fans and internal power drivers, so you want to be about 6 inches away at least. Depending on the power of the device, though, you might need to be further away so you don't get too much intensity, and a lot of devices on the market end up just being fancy heat lamps because they're delivering so much intensity and they're causing so much heat that the heat mechanisms will take over. But I just want to emphasize, you really don't need to overthink a lot of this stuff. You stand at a reasonable range away, you do it for 10 to 20 minutes, maybe you do your front side and your back side, but it's a very simple treatment to do. So, we don't need to overthink it too much. So also to optimize your red light therapy is to know where to target. So if you get a full body device, I think that's part of the popularity of a full body device is that you're just covering your whole body. And, if you don't have to really think about where you're targeting, you're just hitting the whole body and you're hoping for the best. If you get a smaller device, then you have to start thinking about where do you target to get the best results. And obviously the most important place is the site of the pathology, is the area you have a pain, you have wound, you have inflammation. If you want to target certain organs, your brain, your heart, your thymus for immune system, kidneys, adrenals, things like that, then you aim it directly over those organs or those systems or those areas. So it's pretty intuitive where you want to direct your treatments. Then we have systemic targets, where if you want to do something more complementary in addition to your targeted treatments, you can target the gut. You can target stem cell production in the tibia, in the sternum, and in the forehead. You can target your blood, like your wrists, your navel, and really anywhere. There's blood all over your body, so a lot of times you get systemic benefits no matter where you aim your device. And you can target your lymph nodes. So if you don't know where to target, if you don't have anything, immediately wrong with you, you just want some systemic benefits, then you can target some of these areas. Or a lot of studies are using them as a combination treatment, like they'll treat the gut and the forehead for a brain treatment. So treating the gut, the gut has a big connection to the brain, so they've started to treat the gut when they're doing stuff like Parkinson's studies. And of course, we can use red light therapy to help optimize our circadian rhythm. It helps us build intracellular melatonin, which is very good for an antioxidant effect. And, if you use it on the face in the mornings, I think it's kind of a stand-in for bright light therapy. So it's a very good way to wake up and have that kind of wake-up light. And you're getting the benefits for your facial skincare as well. So I think that's a good time to do your facial skincare, is to do it in the mornings. So red light therapy safety, overall, it's very safe. Again, these are wavelengths that are in a very large proportion from sunlight. So our skin and our eyes are very well acclimated to red and near infrared light. So as long as we're doing reasonable intensities and reasonable doses, then you really shouldn't have any problems with red light therapy. Again, unless you have some sort of pre-existing condition, some sort of medication that might cause photosensitivity, you might want to get that checked out. But overall, it shouldn't cause problems unless you've got some really reckless device that's too high intensity. It could be causing a lot of heat. And then, too much dose causes cellular inhibition, could cause apoptosis and ROS. So it's really not worth it. So like I said, less is more with red light therapy. And even when you overdose with red light therapy, there's usually no acute effects. Like at worst, you get skin redness or maybe hyperpigmentation. But again, that's really with excessive doses. A lot of times, you don't know if you've overdosed with red light therapy because there are no side effects, which, is a good thing, but it's also kind of concerning because you don't know if you're doing it right or wrong. If you have tattoos or if you have a darker skin type, you do get more superficial heating. And so in those cases, sometimes studies will lower the intensity if you have a darker skin type, and you might need a higher dose because the melanin in your skin is absorbing more of the light superficially. So especially if you have a deep penetration target and you have a dark skin type, you might need higher doses. So some conditions, pregnancy, it hasn't really been tested, so we can't really give advice on pregnancy. Some studies might might mention, it's good indirectly for back pain, so just not to directly treat the abdomen, but maybe you could use it for other areas, and that's perfectly fine. But again, it's just out of an abundance of caution that we just don't have the data. It's probably fine. For cancer, you don't want to directly treat cancer cells unless, your doctor is supervising that. It may be helpful to use, to manage some symptoms and side effects. It's getting popular for oral mucositis, which is a side effect from chemotherapy. So there are ways it could be used, but again, it should be under a doctor's supervision. Some anecdotal feedback I get from autoimmune people is that they say, lower doses work better for them. Again, red light therapy might stimulate the immune system, so you don't want too much of a dose. You have to especially go low and slow if you've got some sort of issue. With thyroid, again, you want to stick to low doses, if you're aiming at the neck, but it is generally very safe, especially if you don't have a thyroid condition. It's very safe for the thyroid. If you do have a thyroid condition or are on medication, then you need to work with your doctor. And for the gonads, a lot of guys want to use it for testosterone. There's a lot of claims flying around there that aren't well substantiated. It's good for blood flow and nitric oxide and things like that. So there's definitely benefits to doing it. But again, just stick to low doses and make sure there's not a lot of heat. And for the eyes, red and near infrared light is very safe for the eyes. It doesn't cause cataracts. That might be kind of some old myths that said it might cause cataracts. It really shouldn't cause cataracts, again, unless you've got excessive intensity that's causing heating of the eyeballs. And you really would be feeling that on your face and on your eyes if something felt super hot. So you really shouldn't worry about cataracts or eye problems. Generally, it's beneficial for the eyes. So, again, as long as you're doing it reasonably and not doing too much intensity, then it's perfectly fine. We say just don't stare directly at the lights. Don't use it don't squash it up on your eyes and your face. And you can close your eyes or keep them open. So with most of my devices, I say goggles aren't required unless you want it for comfort or if you have some special kind of photosensitivity. And in that case, you can get these sunglasses or welding goggles called Shade 5 or IR5. They're pretty cheap on Amazon, so just search for those terms and you can get some cheap safety glasses or welding goggles. So let's talk about flicker and EMFs. So flicker is a modulation of brightness or intensity. So it's very similar to pulsing in that way. So it's just kind of an up and down of the brightness or intensity. And, it can be very rapid with our alternating current cycles. So usually it's twice the AC cycle. So in America, it's around 120 hertz is the flicker frequency. Now, most of the time, flicker is invisible from light bulbs and even from red light therapy devices. It's invisible because when it's faster than about 70 hertz, then our brain perceives it as continuous, even though it could be flickering. And, even though it's invisible, there's very well documented that could still cause eye strain, headaches, anxiety, mood disorders, and seizures. So, we still want to be careful with too much flicker. So with flicker characteristics, it's important to understand the frequency, that's the hertz. Again, we talked about how many cycles per second that's going on. And then a lot of people don't talk about is the percentage of the modulation. That's the magnitude of the flicker. So if we look at this graph out here on the left, we have two frequencies, two flickers that both are at the same frequency, but the magnitudes are different. The percentage flicker is very different. So the orange line here is going to be relatively safer because the percentage isn't as high. It doesn't go down all the way to 0. The blue line is going to be a much more hazardous form of flicker because it goes all the way to off and then all the way back on. And so, a lot of people talk about the frequency too much with flicker and they don't know what they're talking about because it's more important usually to talk about the percentage or, they're kind of both connected. So you have to talk about both. But a lot of people kind of miss out on that. Some companies I've saw will claim, we have 1 hertz flicker, which is, nonsense because that would mean it's flickering once per second. You would be able to visibly see on, off once per second. So, a lot of people just don't know what they're talking about when they talk about flicker kind of metrics and what to actually watch out for. So in my experience, the frequency isn't the problem. It's more the percentage. And what we've done with our devices, we use DC adapters that are very high quality. So it's very low percentage of flicker. And then also, devices, red light therapy devices can have non-native EMFs, and usually those are the low frequency EMFs from the electric fields and the magnetic fields. And again, we have many ways to mitigate that with grounding. Some of our small devices, we remove the fans and adapters and make those external, or we just don't need fans in the first place because we use properly low intensities. And so we mitigate our EMFs very well. And then some companies will add back in EMFs in terms of radio frequencies if they want, Bluetooth and Wi-Fi and cell phone apps and all this stuff. And then they're adding back in the radio frequencies. Okay, and now let's take a look at various different devices of red light therapy. The nice thing about it is it can be built into all different shapes and sizes for different applications or convenience or for power or efficiency. So it's really neat of how many different ways it's going to be implemented into daily life, and to think about this as kind of a supplement that, we can use routinely, or as a therapy, as, something therapeutic for a limited time that we use. So let's just kind of run down different categories of devices. So we have wearables. These are more flexible pads, wraps, masks that you can strap on your face for skincare, hats that you can put on your head for either brain health or for hair health. Then you get full body panels, the big panels that you might hang on a wall or hang on a stand. And, sometimes you can get laying down pods and beds and apparatus that, you can lay down underneath the panel. But, these big full body panels are a nice way to introduce it into the household. Then we have mini panels, half body panels, desktop panels, handheld devices. So all different shapes and sizes of smaller panels that a lot of times they're very budget friendly. They're a great way to get started with red light therapy. And, you can still appreciate, you get a lot of bang for your buck from smaller devices that might be more convenient to use. And you can still get a lot of benefits from them. And you don't need to, think that you need a full body panel, because, there's not even a lot of studies on full body devices. A lot of them are more targeted treatments. Then some interesting devices is the FlexBeam Recharge and the Kineon Move Plus. These are kind of hybrid wearables. They get a little bit more power than like your standard wrap, because they've got these solid modules that have better kind of heat sinks or cooling mechanisms. So you get a little bit more power in these modules than you would get from a mask or a wrap. But you can still strap them on. They've got a semi-flexible kind of setup so it can contour to the body. So I think this will be an interesting area that as more devices come out, we'll want to see more devices in this hybrid kind of setup. Then there's a lot of like flashlights and torches. Sometimes they can be pretty much a hack. This is the Convoy S2 that I got from AliExpress for about $17. It's a 660 nanometer wavelength. It's got plenty of power. So again, if you're really strategic with where you target, like what I've taught you, you can get a lot of bang for your buck just from targeted treatments with a flashlight or a torch. And, you can appreciate a lot of lasers are just very small dot, and they got a lot of benefits in the clinical studies with just small spot-sized lasers. Then another interesting device is like an intranasal device. So the V-Light makes them, and another company called ProNeuroLight makes them. And, you kind of shove them up your nose. They advertise that they're targeting the base of the brain, but what they're really doing is more of a systemic treatment for treating the blood flow in your nose. And if you think about if you've ever gotten a nosebleed, there is a lot of blood circulating up your nose, and it kind of bypasses the skin, the skin kind of blocking some of the light as being on the inside of the nose. So really, I consider it more of a systemic benefit, and a lot of researchers think of this as more of a systemic treatment, but it's been proven to be very effective. So it's really hard to say what's the best device for a particular person or a particular condition. I really encourage people to look at all these different devices. That's why I've laid them all out here on a slide, and try to envision what you would use in your daily life. Try to think about when you would use it, where you would use it, if you'd have to go out of your way to use it, how you could fit it in with your limited amount of time. And really, that's going to be the best device for you, is any device that you can be consistent with and be compliant with using over a long period of time. You don't want these things collecting dust. If you don't use them, they're not going to give you the benefits. So really think about what you're going to use and how you're going to use it, and not just, fall into all the claims of, oh, we have the best thing. No, we have the best thing. No, this guy has the best thing. Think about how you're going to use it. And that's going to be the best product for you, is what you can use consistently. Then another category of device is the near-infrared incandescent heat lamps. And so these go by a lot of different names. They call them near-infrared heat lamps, even though they don't actually emit a lot of near infrared, but it's more of a marketing name for them. But, they're just an incandescent bulb with a red coating on them, and that gives you a very nice spectrum of mostly red, some near infrared, and a lot of this mid infrared. So there's a lot of debate. Is this, a red light therapy device because it emits 23% of the light in the optical window, 600 to 1100 nanometers, or is it not because it's got very high intensity, it's got a lot of heating wavelengths, so really the mechanisms are going to be more of a heat therapy than a photobiomodulation therapy, which is by definition non-thermal. But regardless, I can appreciate they're very beneficial, if they're a heat therapy, if they're a light therapy, they're still very beneficial if you use them properly, and they're very affordable. You can get them for about $10 per bulb, especially if you get some of the generic kind of brands, the GE, the Philips, the FET Electric, and Halco. I've tested all of them. They all work very well, and they work just as well as some of the name brand heat lamps from SaunaSpace, TheraBulb, and Rubylux. And so you can get this therapy real cheap. And, if you want to build your own sauna, there's Dr. Lawrence Wilson's book on the sauna therapy that he kind of designed this for incandescent bulb kind of sauna. And there's some DIY sauna guides. You can look at Quantified Bob's website for some guides, or just Google it. So you can use it as a sauna therapy or as just a targeted heat therapy if you just get one lamp. And, it's very beneficial. So I encourage people, if you just want to try something out on a budget, this might be a great way to get started with red light therapy. Even though it's more of a kind of a heat therapy, there's still tons of benefits for it. And just to shift topics for a little bit, is to cover red ambient light at night, and just to focus on the circadian rhythms of how red light therapy works, and the blue lights and things like that. I know Thaddeus talks about getting proper blue light during the day from natural sources like sunlight, and we saw in one of the first slides that about 15% of sunlight is blue light. So it's very beneficial, especially when it's blended in with the rest of the spectrum. That blue light is very helpful during the day. That keeps you awake, and that's anchoring your circadian rhythms. However, at night, we want to avoid blue-rich lighting, so a lot of the white LED light bulbs, they're very rich in blue light. All our screens and stuff are very rich in blue light, and so we want to avoid this artificial blue light at night. And the ways we do that, I know Thaddeus has talked about blue blocker glasses, blue reduction apps like Iris and F.Lux, and so those are very beneficial. And then, you start to think about, hey, maybe I should replace my white light bulbs with red light bulbs at night. Or if red light bulbs are too dim, or maybe they're a little too dramatic for you, you can use yellow bulbs, amber bulbs, orange bulbs as kind of a way to ease yourself into it. You don't need to be super hardcore, and a lot of times it has to do more with the brightness than it does with the wavelength. So you still want dim red lights, or you want dim, yellow or amber or orange. And as long as you can maintain a good amount of dimness in the evenings, that's still going to be very beneficial for you. But we know red light itself has the least impact on melatonin production. So at night, the red light is preferred. And you want to avoid using your bright red light therapy panels on your face and your eyes and your head in the evenings, because again, those are very bright. So it has to do with the brightness and the wavelength. So sometimes if you use too bright of a light at night, even if it's red, then that could also shut off your melatonin production. So you still want dim red lights at night. Maybe if you need to, you can treat different parts of your body, your chest or your back or something, but just avoid the face and the head. So that's it. Just a summary. I'm Andrew Latour from Gemba Red LLC. We went through a lot of the practical aspects and the science of red light therapy, so I hope that was helpful. You can find us at gembared.com, and we have tons of blogs with all the science that backs up what we said here in this course. And you can email me, gembared@gmail.com. Follow me on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube for more info. A lot of this info you might have seen on some of our posts, but we brought it together into these slides for this course. And just search for us at Gemba Red at some of these socials. So thanks for tuning in. Hope that helped.